Hi, I'm Dr. Daniel, and I want to welcome you to the first lesson of my digital functional medicine course. The first goal in a functional medicine setting is to begin the process of identifying the underlying causes of dysfunction and disease. While there are only a few root causes of illness, it should be appreciated that not every one of them is going to be so obvious right away. If there are more than one causes of your illness, then certain causes can actually be masked because of the complexity of our biology. And as you begin to correct imbalances, those masked causes become more obvious. So what you should really take away from that is that when you start to do the right type of testing, you're going to identify imbalances. As you begin to correct those imbalances with additional testing, you might find that there's other imbalances that start to show up that didn't show up previously. So it's very important to not just rely on one single test and assume that you've got it all figured out. So it's important, again, to understand that working on root cause resolution takes time and is almost never going to be addressed from initial testing or analysis. This is actually why most clinicians fail at helping their patients. They typically think that a blood test or a functional test is the answer, when in reality, it's really only the very first step. When you think about all the possibilities of what could be causing dysfunction and disease in the human body, it really only comes down to two things. You're either deficient in something or you're toxic in something. What I mean by that is you could be deficient in nutrients, so you could have a nutritional deficiency. You could have physical activity or movement deficiency. You could have hormone deficiencies, neurotransmitter deficiencies. You could be deficient in certain immune markers, etc. So there are a lot of things that you could be deficient in. You could be deficient in love or community or purpose. You could also be toxic with certain things. You could be toxic with infections, whether that's viruses or bacteria or parasites or fungus. You could be toxic in allergens or compounds that your immune system doesn't like, whether that is things like mold and pollens from outside or certain foods that you're eating. You could be toxic in toxins themselves. There's a number of different chemicals that are in our environment. This is industrial waste products, it's pollution, it could be heavy metals. You could be toxic in emotions. You could be toxic with certain types of stress and even in movement. So some people, they overexert themselves. Again, a lot of times you can break down these dysfunctions into, again, either a deficiency or a toxicity. Now, from those two categories, we can further describe the root cause of disease. And this could be one or any combination. But this is usually going to come down to your nutrient status. It's going to come down to stress, either physical or emotional. It's going to come down to toxins, again, allergens, food sensitivities, chemicals, exposure to industrial waste products. This is going to come down to infections. There's also environmental impact. So literally the environment that you live in, whether that is your home, your living situation, or the city that you live in. And then also there is the all important factor of genetics, which is really not the primary part of our root causes of disease, but it certainly can contribute in some cases. Now, in this lesson, I want to discuss each and every one of the above mentioned root causes and a few ways to begin to understand if they're actually posing a problem for you. Let's start off with nutrient status. Nutrition is the single most influential component of health maintenance and restoration. There's no question that diet is a determining factor in many diseases, including obesity, cancer, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, liver disease, childhood development disorders, and autoimmunity. All of those are going to be impacted by your nutrition. So whether your doctor likes it or not, food is actually the most powerful form of medicine. But optimal nutrition, the level of nutrient intake that maintains the best possible health for our body, is actually highly variable from one person to person. And this is because we are all biochemically different and unique. And our biochemical individuality influences our individual needs for certain nutrients. And this is why some diets work for some people and some diets fail for others. because nutrients, vitamins, and minerals play such a fundamental role in cellular metabolism. As insufficiencies develop, the effects can be system-wide, and they can extend downstream to cause all sorts of symptoms and even disease. So the stages of nutrient status really go from initial biochemical alterations, meaning you could have some suboptimal levels of nutrients. That's going to start to impact your biochemistry. You're not going to have symptoms, but you're suboptimal, meaning you don't have the right nutrients, the right amount of nutrients in your body, and you don't have any symptoms. That leads to dysfunction, and eventually it leads to impaired cellular function. And this is where you start to pick up on subclinical signs. So there are some symptoms that are going to be associated with this, but not enough for you to really start to think that you've got some major issues. Eventually, there's going to be morphological changes, literally tissue structural changes and functional tissue changes. And this is what we would identify as early stage disease. And if you allow that to continue, finally, you're going to have a diagnosed pathology or end organ failure. Next, let's talk about physiological stress. One of the central themes of ancestral medicine is that there is a profound mismatch between our genes and the modern environment. And this mismatch is driving the current epidemic of chronic disease. Our diet is one of the most frequently mentioned examples of this mismatch, like we just talked about. But there is another example that I believe is every bit as important, but far less commonly recognized. And that is the human stress response system. We've all heard of the fight-flight response system. The stress response is primarily governed by something known as the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Stress activates the HPA axis and sets off a cascade of neuroendocrine signals that ultimately lead to the release of hormones and neurotransmitters such as cortisol, norepinephrine or noradrenaline, and epinephrine or adrenaline. And this is an extremely complex system, but for the purpose of this course, the key thing to understand is that the mechanism in which the body engages in response to stress is protective in the short term, but if you continue to have repeated stressful situations and stimuli, it's going to be damaging in the long term. So when the HPA axis is dysfunctional, this was referred to as HPAD or HPA dysfunction. And research has shown that there are 4 primary triggers of HPAD. Number 1 is your perceived stress. This includes emotional and psychological stress. Number 2, glycemic or glucose or blood sugar dysregulation. This is basically includes both high and low blood sugar or alternating between the two. Then there's circadian disruption, and this includes sleep deprivation, too much exposure to light at night, or not enough exposure to light during the day, shift work, and frequent traveling across time zones. And then you're going to have inflammatory signaling. And this includes inflammation caused by a poor diet, by physical inactivity or overtraining, GI dysfunctions such as small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO, or dysbiosis or infections, autoimmune disease, and a variety of other modern sources of inflammation that all, again, come together to cause HPA dysfunction. Another issue to think about are the exposure to toxins and allergens. The human body is constantly exposed to harmful agents, and it could be argued that any disease process can be caused or complicated by toxic load. It's no longer a question of whether industrial chemicals, pollutants, or xenobiotics are causing disease, but how susceptible we are as individuals to the exposure of these toxins. Research has demonstrated that an average of 200 chemicals in the umbilical cord blood of newborns is present. This means that right from day one of our lives, we have an average of 200 chemicals, most of which have actually not been properly tested in terms of human impact. Toxins can gain entry through our skin, through our lungs when we're breathing, through the GI tract from the foods that we're consuming. So there's many routes for toxins to get into our body, and the degree to which disease is influenced by toxins depends on the levels of exposure, how well the protective mechanisms keep tissue level toxic effects in check. And this is usually going to be influenced by genetics or epigenetics, meaning how your ancestors lived. By evaluating toxic load and exposure and individual detoxification capacity through blood chemistry, along with individual nutritional assessment, it's absolutely possible to manage toxins and compounds that are negative for human health. So again, very, very important thing to think about. There's also infections that could be causing at the root cause of disease. When a microorganism such as a virus, a fungus, or a bacteria infects an individual, it's certainly possible for a disease to occur beginning with fever, swelling, pain, redness, and symptoms including vomiting, cough, and fatigue. And this is the classical presentation of an infection, but it's not always the way that infections cause problems. Medical science is now demonstrating that a wide variety of symptoms and signs of disease are associated with infections, yet you don't present with the typical presentation of an infection. And the concept that microorganisms are able to persist in the body and continue to produce illness over weeks or months or even years is becoming more widely appreciated. Usually people think of infections as having a fever, right? Or redness or swelling, where you start to get nauseous. We are now determining that you could absolutely have bugs in your body that are causing problems and you don't have any of those symptoms, but yet they're contributing to disease. So it's interesting how some people can carry a certain microbe and never develop symptoms or disease, whereas others not so much. A good example of this is Helicobacter pylori, or H. pylori, which is a bacteria that is known to cause ulcers, gastritis, and it's one of the most common causes of stomach cancer. Interestingly, half of the population, over 50%, or 1 out of every 2 people that you meet, is going to actually carry H. pylori. They have it in their body, but not everyone actually succumbs to it or has issues with it. Examples of persistent infection which continues to cause disease is readily accepted in diseases including syphilis, tuberculosis, AIDS, Lyme disease, chronic hepatitis, HSV, herpes virus, right? So these are all infections that we fully accept that could continue to cause problems over time. So keep in mind that you could absolutely have infections that are causing issues in your body, even though you're not overtly sick. Today, many patients with persistent, unexplained symptoms of disease are very likely to be manifesting illness resulting from what we would like to call stealth infections. Finally, at the root of many diseases are going to be the genetics and environment that we present with. Although chronic diseases are primarily environmental, meaning they're not genetic in origin, we fully know that almost 80% of what we experience in terms of ill health or disease is because of our environment, not because of our genetics. The particular environmental causes of these diseases, though, are poorly understood. Even though we know that genetics doesn't contribute to the majority of disease, we know more about genetics. We know less about how the environment impacts us, yet we know that that's what contributes to most of it. A World Health Organization study of worldwide cancer mortality, deaths associated with cancer, identified 9 diverse environmental factors, including pollution, diet, lifestyle factors such as sleep, community, emotional health, drug abuse, and infections were all leading reasons for causing cancer, at least cancer deaths. However, the joint effect of these 9 factors accounted for only 1/3 of cancer mortality, indicating that about 2/3 are of unknown etiology. So keep in mind that there's still a lot that we don't know about when it comes to the environment. There is something called the exposome, and this is a concept that was originally proposed by Dr. Christopher Wilde in 2005. It refers to the sum of all non-genetic exposures in an individual's lifetime, starting from the moment you're born. And actually, we can even go before that, how your parents lived and how your grandparents lived, and they passed on traits to the point to where you were born, and then everything that you experience until your death, that is the exposome. That is what we're trying to quantify in terms of what's causing issues for our body. So the exposome encompasses everything from the food that we eat, the water that we drink, the air that we breathe, the social interactions we have, the lifestyle choices we make every day, to the health, again, of our parents, and all leading up to the time of our conception. In short, it's the word scientists are using to describe the full range of environmental exposures that influence our health. And the reason the exposome is important as a concept is that we now know it is the primary driver of human health and disease. If genes cause less than 10% of disease, it only makes sense that the exposome, our diet, our lifestyle, the environment that we live in, drive the remaining 90%. The recognition that environment, not genetics, is the primary driver of human health and disease carries with it a strong message of personal empowerment and responsibility. This means you have 100% control over changing your health. If our genes were only, the only determinant of our health, then there wouldn't be much motivation to change your environment, because there's nothing you could do about it. But that's just not true. Since we know that the choices that we make in our lifetime predict 90% of our risk of disease and early death, we have a strong reason to begin to take actions to improve our health.